So I'm here with, actually, can you share with us your name and spell it for us?
Yes. My name is Patricia Irene Elizondo. Everyone calls me Patti or Patty, and that would be P-A-T-T-I. And Elizondo, of course, is E-L-I-Z like zebra, O-N-D-O.
And I am Geremy Landin, interviewing Miss Elizondo for the West Side Sound Oral History Project. We are currently at the Rinconcito de Esperanza in the casita in the back. It's 816 South Colorado Street, San Antonio, Texas 78207. It's about 2:30 in the afternoon, and Miss Elizondo has agreed to partake in this interview, but just for to follow our protocol, do you agree to allow us to use this interview for the West Side Sound Oral History Project in conjunction with UTSA's special collections?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go through a series of questions with you. We're talking specifically today about West Side Sound, but in this case, you as a descendant of the Elizondo family and the contributions that La Gloria, and you have corrected me in the past about the how we refer to La Gloria. Could you just tell me briefly, just to give us a note on what we should refer to La Gloria as?
Yes. La Gloria was originally a filling station for gasoline, but in those days it was kerosene. But in any case, it was to fill, fuel into the cars. But it had a lot of other functions. Now, what happened in the Depression is what made this building iconic, and that is that, I don't know if you want me to go into the details, but basically we have a dance floor that was installed, and that was to be able to pay off the loan that Matilde Elizondo owed the Frost Bank 18 months after La Gloria was inaugurated. The Depression hit, and so it's not a dance hall. That's not correct, because the connotations that go with dance hall don't apply. So it's called a roof garden, La Gloria Roof Garden. It was a place where anyone could go, any age, any ethnicity, any race, and have a wonderful evening under the stars, dancing to the latest and best orchestras.
So we will, throughout the interview, refer to La Gloria as La Gloria, but want to also note that Patty, as part of the Elizondo family, has made that differentiation, so we want to respect that as well. So we're actually going to start with a few questions about you, yourself, and your background, your upbringing, and then we will get into some of the questions about West Side Sound and La Gloria. So, of course, you shared with us your name. What is your date of birth and your, where were you born, where were you raised?
I was born on January 11th, 1955, here in San Antonio, downtown, where our neighborhood was, it was known as the Immaculate Heart of Mary, El Corazón de María neighborhood, and it surrounded that beautiful church built by the Parisians in 1912. So when I was born, my father had purchased the La Gloria number 2 from my grandfather, which was a grocery store in Mid-Market, and it had a little alleyway, and then it had a house, and then it had a bodega. So he bought the property so that he could raise his own family, and it was shortly thereafter, I think I was 6 months old, that the state of Texas started building I-35. It was the first highway built under the Eisenhower law that said that all the United States had to be connected by state highways. They really killed the neighborhood because they split that parish in half. So people who shopped in our part of the neighborhood or who went to church there had to change their lifestyle and go someplace else. And so what ended up happening is shortly after I was born a few, I think, months into my life there, the city demolished 500 buildings, including our business and our home, the entire neighborhood. And so we moved to La Gloria number 4, which was a trailer park on Frio City Road that my grandfather had established after World War II, when all the boys were coming back from the war. They all wanted to get married and start their families because they'd been, you know, basically sequestered for the entire length of the war. And so he had 100 pecan trees on Frio City Road, which was out in the country, to raise pecans, because pecans were very lucrative in those days. And once, you know, the World War II soldiers came back, he decided he was going to have a trailer park there. So with every tree, there was space that he made available to trailers, and then he installed water and electricity so that they could have the modern conveniences. And my father built another La Gloria that he called Superette. It was a Quonset building, these hyperbolic designs, and so that was a grocery store and a meat market, but it didn't have a neighborhood, so it didn't succeed. And at that point, we moved away from San Antonio, and then there's a whole succession of moves that I don't know if you want me to go into.
No. Do you have siblings?
No.
No.
I'm
So
an only child.
you're an only child. When you mentioned the parish, can you talk to us a little bit about what it was like growing up in that parish, and what was the name of it again?
It was the Immaculate Heart of Mary in English, El Corazón de María in Spanish. I didn't grow up there because, remember, I was a baby when we moved away, and then we moved out of San Antonio when I was 2.
Oh, okay.
And then we moved to Monterrey, Mexico, which was my mother's hometown. I learned Spanish, start my schooling there. Then we moved back to Texas, but El Paso. In when I was 6 and a half, I had to learn English from scratch. And then we moved back to San Antonio in 1966 when I was 11, but only for 11 months, because at that point my father had started his work was a theater manager. So movie and drive-in theaters. But we were stuck in El Paso. He wanted to bring us back. He always wanted to come back to his hometown, San Antonio. And we came back with Interstate Theaters, who built the Majestic and the Aztec Theaters. And he managed those, and he was such a good troubleshooter that Interstate started moving us to other places. So we ended up going 11 months later to Austin. Wow. And he managed the Austin Theater there, also part of Interstate. Then they moved us to Fort Worth for the Wedgwood, which was a very new theater they had built. And that was 3 years. And then finally, he was able to get a job with the Alameda, which was owned by a person, Maurice Baraja, who was actually Arabic, and I think he was French Arabic, because Maurice is French, and he owned the Alameda and the Nacional. So we moved back in order for my father to serve as the manager for the Alameda. The Nacional, coincidentally, was run by my mother's brother, Edwin Elizondo, and that was still during the heyday of the Alameda, towards the end of its heyday, but it was just wall-to-wall people whenever they brought the Mexican singers. In fact, my first encounter with Vicente Fernandez was when I was 11 years old, and my grandmother Tita said, "Mi Santa, quiero conocer quiero ir a ver a Rafael." Rafael was a Spanish singer. He was the act, you know, the draw. But Vicente Fernandez was the opening act.
Oh, wow.
And I remember sitting there in the theater, and I had already experienced all these Mexican movies from 4.5 years of watching Mexican film. And I said, you know, this guy has a beautiful voice, but it's too loud. He's going to have to temper it. And, you know, he wouldn't move the microphone away and all the little techniques. And I was just 11, but I realized that he was going to be an up-and-coming singer. but I had already experienced Javier Solis, who had died. And so then Vicente walks into that void, and the rest is history. So that's my, that was one of the memories that I hold about the Alameda. There are many others that I'm sure you would want to skip at this point.
What high school did you graduate from?
I went to 2 high schools. The first one was in Fort Worth. I had a 4-year scholarship to Nolan High School, which is a Marianist school, and it's the same priest as Central Catholic.
And St. Mary's University.
And St. Mary's University. And on my first week, I was, meekly eating my little lunch in the cafeteria, and I see this gentleman right beside me with his, dark suit and the whole 9 yards that the brothers wore, and I look up, and it's Brother Henry Rinconcito, the principal of Nolan High School. And I'm like, okay, I'm in trouble. What did I do? And he looks down at me and he says, young lady, what is your name? And I said, Patty Elizondo, Brother Rinconcito. And he said, are you related to Oscar and Caesar and Deli? My father and his 2 brothers who went to Central. I said, yes, Brother Rinconcito. He said, I remember those boys. So I said, oh, great. They remember the really good ones and the really bad ones. Yeah. So, what does that do for me? But no, he was very nice, and we took him to lunch. I told my father we took him to lunch later. It was a really nice experience.
Awesome.
Oh, and then we moved to San Antonio, so I had to give up the scholarship. I gave it 3 years of free schooling at really the best high school in the Dallas, Arlington, Fort Worth area. And then I came to Ursuline because my cousins, the Villarreal family, my tío Jesse, who was first cousin with my father, he had 9 children, and all of them were going through, the girls were going through Ursuline. So I did my last 3 years at Ursuline Academy.
Awesome. Talk to us about your education, and then we'll go into your professional career. So when you left Ursuline, what was your educational path?
Okay, so I really enjoyed photography because from the moment that I opened my eyes in this world, my father had a camera in front of me. He had an Argus, which you had to set everything for. There was no automatic in those days. And I got used to being photographed, but I also got used to wanting to be the photographer. And he would set it for me, and he would say, okay, now I'm going to be in the picture, you just snap this button. But I said, I want to compose the image. I want to do, So I wanted to study communications based on my photography interest, but I also had, through osmosis, because I watched so many movies, eventually American movies, but the golden age of Mexican cinema was absolutely to die for. Lighting, Gabriel Figueroa he was great photographer, cinematographer, on and on. So I said, I really want to study communications so that I can do these things, audio, video, photography, the whole 9 yards. Film. I was thinking more film, still photographs, that kind of thing. So I received a scholarship, the President's Scholarship from Incarnate Word University, and I got a scholarship from Trinity University, and the counselor was a nun, and she said, Patty, I see that you're signing up, you're leaning towards Incarnate Word, aren't you going to do your communications? I said, yes, sister, but I can't turn down the President's Scholarship. I'll it's very rude, and the President extended that to me, so I don't want to hurt her feelings. And she said, you're not going to hurt her feelings. We're going to arrange for you to go thank the sister in charge of Incarnate Word, but I want you to go see Mr. Henry Morales, the father of the later Attorney General, Dan Morales. But at that time, Dan was probably in school. So anyway, I went, and he was a charming man, and they were trying to recruit more Hispanics to Trinity. So he arranged for grants from the state of Texas, federal grants. Trinity had a scholarship, and then the loan was teeny tiny. It was so small that I didn't feel uncomfortable signing on the dotted line. So it was like being in Wonderland. They had the best equipment. They had Aeroflex cameras. They had all the equipment. They had Sennheiser tape recorders. Everything was movie and television grade equipment. So when you graduated in that department, you had a ready-made resume because you had worked with CBS Network, and you had worked. We would do the parades downtown, the Battle of the Flowers and the Flambeau. We were the crew. That it was the only mobile television production unit in San Antonio and in the region. So we always got hired out, and you had to use the students if you were going to hire the equipment.
Awesome. So you went to Trinity, and then did you work on a master's as well?
No, I graduated. In those days, you really didn't further your education unless you were going to be an MD, a lawyer, or a scientist, or somebody who needed higher education. And I was afraid that if I educated myself, or not over-educated, but if I had too many degrees, that I wouldn't be able to get a job with a television station or with, a company that dealt with what I was interested in. Now, I wasn't really interested in television. I was interested in photography. But once we started doing the coursework, I realized television is instant. You don't have to go and wait for the lab. In those days, you had to send the film to the lab. You didn't have to wait for anything. You were actually editing as you were doing the 3-camera setup. So it was wonderful. I loved it, and I fell in love with TV. And that's where I decided to sort of channel my my career, but I didn't need to at that point. I didn't.
And I guess just briefly, do you want to tell us about your career, where you started, where you ended?
It was very kind of interesting because it didn't work the way I planned it. It just kind of happened. The first job I got was with the University of Mexico, which is affiliated with UNAM, the gigantic, it's at that point it had 200,000 students in Mexico City. And they had this school in San Antonio and had it for 50 years. And so it was the first foreign extension school that UNAM had. And it was brought in by businessmen and academics, back when, in fact, they started at Trinity University. They were housed there, and then they got the building downtown. So I worked there for a year because they told me they had television equipment. I was so excited. I said, oh, great, I'm going to make some great documentaries here and tape their events and all that. Well, it was very antiquated. And I soon realized that maybe I should have auditioned the equipment first. But the end result of that, and that's why I'm telling you that the career was guided by God, really, because I did speak Spanish, and it was the Castilian Spanish that I speak in Mexico. But when you don't use certain terms every day, I mean, I was talking to my family, my parents, my cousins, my friends. There's a certain level of vocabulary that you don't use. So that's what I acquired in the year that I spent at UNAM. I honed up my skills. I bought lots of books at the bookstore, which I was in charge of the bookstore and the audiovisual department. The students would come to listen to tapes so that they could get the right accent. And I really, talking to all these professors who had PhDs, just opened up a whole new world because my vocabulary level shot up, as well as the words that I was handling and the ideas. I could express them in Spanish, whereas before I would have had to go through a lot of verbiage. So that improved my language skills greatly. Then I already had French and Italian from my academic education, so that helped a lot. the Spanish honing of the skills. Then I was hired by UA Columbia Cablevision, which was the first cable system that San Antonio had 6 companies ago. So today is 2022, and we started back in 1979, and they had 2 mobile units. They had 1 large mobile unit and 2 small ones. No, excuse me, 1 and one mobile unit and a small one, and then they had several satellite studios. So they had 1 main, 1 downtown, and then they had several satellite studios. And I came in on the ground floor. I was the first employee in that department, which opened up all kinds of avenues. I stayed there 8.5 years, and my last title was assistant production manager. I did so many things. In at a certain point, I wanted to get back to hands-on, so I developed some programs that were weekly programs. Some were specials, and I did one with the University of Mexico called Plaza Mexico, where they talked about all their exhibits and the cultural aspect. So it was, I believe we were a 15-minute program, but we did it every week, and it was just fabulous. So I was doing what I love to do, and I was also a manager, so I had a title that was nice, but it got to the point where I wasn't learning anymore, and suddenly, I just didn't feel like I was really advancing. At this point, Father Patricia Elizondo, who had started his television mass and had asked me to participate as a technician, we directed. Homer Villarreal and I started that, and actually he started it and I joined it, and we would direct the TV masses, when the Pope came, all these different projects that were fascinating. So I had told him that I was leaving. In fact, I told him I had already left my job at the cable system, and he talked to the brand new general manager of KWEX, which everybody calls Univision, but Univision is the network. It's like saying CBS. You don't call Channel 5 CBS. So KWX were the call letters of the first Spanish language TV station in the country, and the first radio station, KCOR, in the country. And so so he talked to the manager about me, and they hired me to be an editor, to help them with the crunch. I was still working with Father Vigilio with the Mass, and he would get all kinds of donations and letters and things that I helped him handle. But I would go at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 3:30, and I would help the crew with the editing of the news stories that were going to be on at 5. So there was always, an influx of work at the last minute, and I would help them edit, and then I would run the studio cameras, which you just have to basically edit. But anyway, it was a good little part-time job, and from that, his news director, Josie Huitisolo, came in from Miami with lots of ideas. And she said, how come we only have a 5 o'clock newscast? We need a 10 o'clock. And so then one day, I was still working with the crew and doing productions and all. And one day, in fact, I think it was a music program they had at SeaWorld. And she said, Bati, come into my office. And this was a Saturday. And I said, oh no, I did something wrong. Why would she call me into her office? I started getting worried. She said, sit down, please. She said, I have been looking for a reporter for 2 weeks. I have found people who are either perfectly fluent in Spanish or perfectly fluent in English, but I can't find someone who knows the language and the culture for both. So you're it. You're going to be my 10 o'clock news reporter. And it was actually both shows. You're going to be my new general assignments reporter. And I was just frozen. I said, oh my goodness. I said, but Josie, I didn't study journalism at Trinity. I studied literature, because I had 3 majors at Trinity. And she said, it's okay, I can teach you how to put together a news story in 2 weeks. I can't teach the other candidates in 2 weeks a language and a culture, so you're gonna do it. I said, well, can I go back to being a technician if I don't like it? She said, yes, but you will like it. And she was right. It was just like, again, like being a kid in Wonderland and having all of this equipment, and you know, it was like having open doors everywhere. Fascinating. And what I liked among all the different things that happened during that stint was that I was the voice for the voiceless. That was very important to me because my grandfather Matilde always protected the poor and the unprotected, the widows, the orphans, the unmarried young ladies. He was always very paternal, and this was my opportunity to sort of follow in his footsteps. I could never be Matilde Elizondo. He was just too wonderful. But I said, wow, I can, you know, we were doing a lot of stories in the West Side. I can defend people, I can speak for them. And that's how it happened. I was with the local station 6 months, and then after that, the network came calling, and I was hired for the network to do a show called TV Mujer. Very popular show, very bad air times. So it didn't last very long, but it was super popular. I mean, I can tell you stories that would go on forever, but it was a wonderful program, and we did magazine-style stories. So I had 6 minutes. One time I remember that we did a story on Ceci Valle, who was a little girl who had leukemia. She was treated at the Santa Rosa Children's Hospital, and she needed a transplant, and they didn't have a match because Hispanics don't sign up for transplants. Well, I did the story, and later I was told by the tissue bank, the bone and tissue bank, that we ran the story 3 times, and every time that we ran the story, they had a spike in people signing up to be donors. So those were the kinds of stories I was used to. And then I went to the National TV Directors and Producers Conference. It was some organization that you didn't have to be a news director, you could go. And I went just to see what was going on, and this gentleman walks up to me and he says, Patty Elizondo? I said, yes. He said, I'm Bob Rogers. I'm the news director for Channel 5. Here's my card. I want you to come talk to me and bring me some of your stories. Well, by then, I already had an Emmy Award and 3 Emmy nominations for my work with Univision in just 3 years. It was fantastic because they gave me so many resources and time to develop the stories. So I went to see him, and he wanted a female anchor for the morning show. I'm a night person. I said, okay, what are the hours? We had to be there at 4 in the morning to go on the air at 6. And, you know, so you had to basically get ready at home because people don't realize that news people don't have makeup artists and hairstylists. You know, they do that in New York, but not here. So you have to get up at 2 in the morning to get ready. And 2 in the morning is more or less when I'm getting to sleep.
Yeah. I'm gonna take just a quick little second real quick, and then we'll start right back up. Give me just a second. Okay, we're back recording again, and you were telling us about your time with Channel 5.
With Channel 5. So what happened with Channel 5 is that it was a good opportunity. Obviously not the time that I was on, because I was pretty much a zombie most of the time that I was on the air. But eventually, Mr. Bob Rogers, developed a program called, I think it was called Channel 5 Saturday morning or something like that. And he innovated that. And so he said, look, I know that this time, you know, your schedule is very difficult, so I'm going to start this program. You and Bruce Cates will anchor it. It's going to be 2 hours from 6 a.m. to to 9 p.m. 9 a.m. Excuse me, 6 to 9 a.m. And it's going to be a variety show. So it was much more like TV Mujer, which I knew was a good formula, except that it was super early. TV Mujer was an afternoon program. Well, long story short, he also wanted me to report, because that's the reason he hired me. He liked my stories. So then I would anchor this program at the ungodly hour of, 4 a.m. and all that business, and then sort of zombie out the rest of the workday. And then I had Sunday and Monday off, and from Tuesday to Friday I was reporting on the 5 and 10 p.m. shows. Okay. So that was hard because your body can't ever get used to the switches. One of the stories that I handled that I do want to mention was that I had been sent to the South Side to cover a school board meeting, normal day, normal assignment, you turn it in, and you always have to change a little bit, tweak it a little bit for the 10 o'clock. So I'm doing that, and I noticed that it was already time for me to go home, and I didn't want my parents to worry about me. So I called home and I said, Mommy, I'm going to be a little late, I'm still finishing here. And she said, are you watching TV? I said, no, I'm working on my story. She said, Luis Donaldo Colosio has just been shot. And he was the next president of Mexico because he was the PRI candidate. I said, what? So I went to see what Univision and Telemundo were airing, and sure enough, it was wall-to-wall, no commercials. It was just live. And so I went to Larry Myers, who was the anchor that night, and I said, Larry, and I have to credit Larry because he's Anglo. I said, Larry, Luis Donaldo Colosio has just been shot. He said, isn't that the next president of Mexico? I said, yes. He said, okay, let's come over here to the producer. And the producer's, typing away, and he said, we have this incident in Mexico. She said, my newscast is full, as in, doesn't matter, we're done. And he said, we will make room for this. I even told her, you can skip my story. But he said, no, we'll open with this breaking story, and Patty, can you stay? And I did. And I mean, it was an enormously long day. The next day, I got in a little bit late. My schedule was 9 a.m., and I don't know, maybe half hour or something, I was late. And they said, you're going to Laredo, and you're going to do a live shot, and you're, blah, blah. And then they delayed me for about 2 or 3 hours. I think it was 2 hours. Because they couldn't decide where to go, which of the Piedras Negras or Laredo, and Channel 5 was going, Channel 12 was going someplace. They couldn't decide. I was like, just decide. Because if you lived in that era, I mean, right now we have a lot of traffic, international traffic with these tractor trailers, but in those days, the wait was 1 hour at the border. 1 hour to cross, 1 hour to cross back. And they wanted this for the 5 and the 10. And I said, we've got to get going. Laredo, that's at least 3 hours away, and we have to take the huge tractor trailer mobile unit and then our own, our own vehicle to get there, the photographer and I. So they delayed me, and then we did the story, and of course, I had to do double work because I had to interview people in Spanish and then voice it with my voice on top of their voice. It was very time consuming, and they sent me so late that by the time I got interviews, nobody wanted to talk because they didn't know if this was a coup d'etat. It was like when Kennedy got shot. Nobody knew what was going on, and the shopkeepers didn't want to speak, and the people on the street, they were all afraid. So finally I got my 3 interviews, and then we had to wait an hour at the border, and then finally we got to our location, and I made the 5 o'clock deadline. But for the 6 o'clock, I said, just do a Q&A because there's no way we can piece together and voice over and all that. Well, they counted that against me, and they said that I hadn't done a good job. I mean, I don't think half of those people even spoke Spanish, much less did they know the consequences of delaying us and all the things in the field that you have to deal with, you know. And so it was a little bit difficult because I found a culture clash.
Mm-hmm.
The people were very nice, most of them, but they didn't understand the community, and they didn't understand that the cultural aspect is super important. Now, Bob Rogers did. He sent me to Mexico on several stories that came back, and everybody raved about them. I also did a story in Mexico about the miraculous water in Querétaro, which went international, and it was shown in it was shown in Up to the Minute, which was a program CBS did nationally. They interviewed me. We had tons of people calling because they wanted to access this water that would cure people from diseases that were incurable. And it was a great story, but they counted against me that I was getting all these phone calls, and so anyway, it was kind of difficult for me because I really was excited about being able to talk about Dia de los Muertos on the air, and the Niñopa in Xochimilco, and you know, all the different aspects of our culture that are so rich, but the station didn't appreciate it, and so they started sort of cutting around the edges, and they eventually treated me like I was a flunky or something, like I didn't know what I was doing. After I had come in with Emmys, you know, with 3 nominations and an Emmy Award in my satchel, so to speak, they didn't appreciate it. So eventually I started, because, you know, I had gotten a lot of, I guess people realized that I spoke perfect Spanish, that I had lived in Mexico, then the advertising world came calling, and I started working for all different kinds of ad agencies and organizations, even film companies that needed script supervisors and all that. So I did that for 11 years.
Wow.
Not a good idea. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who is starting out with a career, because you don't get a salary. You pay, in those days I was paying 40% of what I was making to the federal government, because there wasn't a freelance kind of break. So bad idea. And eventually, one good thing that happened was Nuestra Familia, which was a TV show that was produced at the Oblate School of Theology, and it was directed to the Mexican American community in a spiritual sense. So they were getting a new anchor, and they hired me, and then eventually we did an English and a Spanish version. So every stand-up that I did, we did the English and the Spanish, and then the English was shown on the Odyssey Network, which was a cable network, and we did, ours was on Univision, but there were cities that Univision didn't want the program, and Telemundo would get the program. They would ask that if they could show it. So that was a really good experience, because it was a different audience, and it was a way to sort of practice my Catholic beliefs, and you know, to be able to talk about the spiritual aspect of life and all of that. So all the things that came my way, even the Pope's visit, I was still freelancing, and when the Pope came on his last visit to America, he went to Mexico City, and then he went to St. Louis, and we were hired by the Odyssey Network, based in Nashville, to do the simultaneous translation. So Father Patricia Elizondo and I did the simultaneous translation while he was in Mexico, and then Father David Garcia accompanied us on that to do color commentary. And there was another priest from Fordham University, which I believe is a Jesuit school in Washington. He came in to do a lot of the theology. And I'll never forget when the Pope was in Estadio Azteca, 100,000 people, and they were all cheering, you know, and they were all just just giving him a huge welcome. And there was a sort of pantomime program that was, I want to say it was about 20 minutes long. No dialogue, nothing but music and dance. And because Father Virgil and I were familiar with the foundation of Mexico's, in other words, when the Spaniards came and the different Mexican lineages that were there and the different orders of priests who came, we did the color commentary based on what we were looking at. And the people, the producer and the director were just incredibly impressed because they looked for a script and an outline, and there was none, on the internet. So it was just based on our knowledge of the culture. So those kinds of things, I think, were possible because I was raised as a Mexican person. Even while I was living an American life, and with 2 languages and traveling. I've been in France where I could speak French, and I've been in Italy where I could speak Italian. It's just so much fun. But it was just because of this sort of serendipitous life that I was leading, following my parents wherever the jobs, were calling. And finally, thank God, we ended up back in San Antonio, where we belonged.
Well, thank you. Well, so in a minute, I'm going to take one more break to switch over here the memory card. But I wanted to just make a note, because this is where we'll be going next with the conversation. Right now, we're, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, at the Esperanza Center's Rinconcito de Esperanza on Colorado Street here on the west side of San Antonio. And you can't, it won't be seen by the viewers in the interview. But there's a significance to this place. Can you just tell us briefly why you chose to interview here at the Rinconcito?
Well, the Rinconcito is in the heart of the west side. It's very close to where La Gloria number 3 was located. And it has significance because I've always been fond of the old buildings simply because they tell a story. And if you destroy the building, you pretty much are erasing what happened there. And I've been all over the world, and I've seen other places that were pillaged, like the Roman Forum. It still exists, but in pieces. But I've seen other places that were kept intact, and that, I think, is important because it tells the story of who was there first, and then what happened, and the layers of history. The other reason that I wanted to come here is because there are 2 paintings that are held here, which one of them I know was painted by Mary Agnes Rodriguez, who was one of the supporters of La Gloria, and she's a wonderful artist. And she made a beautiful large painting that I was hoping we could incorporate into this piece. And then Graciela Sanchez surprised me with another painting that she has here of when the people chained themselves to the building. So that's why, I wanted to make sure that we included the visuals, because I am a visual person, and that's how I think. And I think that people retain much more of what you're saying if they can see what you're talking about.
So we will include in the artifacts of the interview photos of both of the paintings that Ms. Elizondo is referring to. And actually the second one she mentioned is a painting by Mary Agnes, it's actually Mary Agnes at a younger age with her neck with a chain around it attached to a pole, which Graciela mentioned to me right before we started interviewing. So we're going to take just a quick break to switch out the card here, and then we'll get started with La Gloria and the music of the West Side. Okay, we are recording once again after that quick break. And actually I wanted to just follow up. There was another organization that you work for that you wanted to mention, if you want to.
Yes, when I was freelancing, and I did work with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, their Making Connections project was very important to the West Side. I was approached by Telemundo to work as their anchor. And I took the job, but I didn't want to be the anchor because I wanted to be able to do the stories, and because they had a different operation than what I was wanting to do. So in other words, my reason for going there, I really wanted to be able to do the stories. So I worked only 8 months because then my mom, who was in her 80s, broke both arms, leaving church. Everything in my life always has to do with church. And in fact, Elizondo means near the church in Basque. So, so I stopped working at Telemundo, and I just did a little more freelance after she got well, just a little bit of freelance. But anyway, yes, we're ready for La Gloria.
So right before we took a short break, you were mentioning La Gloria. And what I'd like for us to do, if you can just give viewers of this oral history, kind of help them visualize La Gloria. What did La Gloria look like to you?
I would like to go a little bit further back, because La Gloria was the name of an enterprise that Matilde Elizondo founded. So he comes to San Antonio at the age of 17, escaping the Mexican Revolution, and eventually he and his brothers helped the rest of the family move here and establish themselves as San Antonio residents. At the age of, 17, 18, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. All right, so he arrives in 1914, and he started working with a gentleman called Chapa, who owned a general store called La Bola. And this gentleman took him under his wing and sort of was like a second father, because he taught him how to order merchandise, how to present it, how to be a merchant. And then in 1918, on January 1st, he always picked these iconic dates. January 1st, 1918, he opened his first La Gloria, which was a general store, and it had groceries. We have pictures, so there are cans and boxes of dry goods, and you could pretty much, your groceries, you could buy them there. And then eventually, so what happened is, when he helped his brothers bring the family to San Antonio, and then they were all here, his parents still had children to raise, because he was 8th in line out of 12 kids. And so he donated this first store to them and set up a second store, which was the one that my father bought from him years later. It was called La Gloria number 2. It was a grocery store, but it was a little bit more modern. When the refrigerated display cases came, because of the meat, you wanted to preserve the meat, and that technology was made available. He bought those machines, those display cases that were all refrigerated, and so then he had an extra sort of layer, which was the meat market. So La Gloria grocery and meat market. Then he set up a gasoline pump in front on the curb. In those days, you would just drive up to wherever, whatever establishment had the pump, and then someone from the store would come in, pump your car with gas, and then you would pay that person and drive away. So it was very common in San Antonio to have these little gasoline pumps. I think La Gloria number 2 might have had 2 of them, but for sure I've seen pictures with 1. And so that was an added way to further the business. It was right behind our the Immaculate Heart of Mary Church, which again was our parish church, and my grandparents gave lots of donations, and they were honored and all that. And then their family homestead was behind La Gloria number 2 at some point, and I think it might have been during this period before La Gloria 3. He had this big warehouse, and he contracted with a Spanish engineer to design a system that would tell the driver behind you which way you were going to turn, because they didn't have blinkers in those days. And it was basically a little hand that you would press a button and the right hand would fall this way out of the window, or if it was the left window, left turn, it would fall this way. So he came up with that, but before he was able to patent it, they came out with the little lights. But he was always looking to the future. And what I would like to say at this point is that really at this point in San Antonio, and pretty much except for the huge cities in the U.S., there were very few cars. Cars were just coming into their own. And you would see a lot of horse-drawn carts around. I mean, that was what was normal. And even transportation for people, it was horse-drawn carriages or cars. And then the cars started becoming more popular. And I want to say here, just kind of like out of the blue, but the electric cars came before the internal combustion engine, but they were killed because the other car has more parts and it takes more money to run them. You need to replace the parts and you have to have the oil changed and all that, and the gas. So that industry, the electric car, died out 100 years ago. It was actually stronger than the internal combustion engine. But you see more vehicles being driving through the streets of San Antonio. A lot of the streets were not even paved. They were just dirt streets because the horse-drawn carriages, they actually needed soft ground so that the horse hooves wouldn't be damaged. So then, as the cars started becoming more popular, he was so forward-thinking that he built the first multi-pump station and the first covered gas station in San Antonio. And this I got from the Conservation Society, who did a research, and they did a poll, and they researched the entire area of San Antonio, and La Gloria number 3 was the first. But in order to make this building work even better, because the first buildings were more normal structures, he paid a lot of money. He had Zachary, the company that still makes our state highways. They built La Gloria number 3. They had steel rebar, they had concrete, and they had brick. And that meant that this building was very, very solid. Excuse me. And so he designed it. And of course he had architects and engineers build this, obviously. But he had them build a room that had no windows so that he could run silent movies. And usually it was 5 cents. That's how much you would pay for a movie. If you went to the Majestic or any of the theaters, 5 cents. And then he had also a way to send packages to Mexico, a way to wire money to Mexico. He had bakery goods brought in, so pan de dulce, campechanas, all kinds of goodies, soft drinks, milk, bread, eggs. So a small grocery store within, so kind of like a convenience store, except that he didn't take advantage of people. He didn't overcharge them because he had the supplies coming in from the other La Glorias. And so you could buy, excuse me, you could buy your supplies when you went to Laredo. This was the last thing you saw on the road to Laredo, which is now Laredo Street. It was the state highway.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it was not the state highway like we know them, but it was the road to Laredo. And the people would get their supplies at La Gloria, go to visit their family in Laredo or in Monterrey or wherever their family was, come back, and then get their supplies to start the week, bread and milk and eggs and whatever, to go home. So it was a multi-use building. He inaugurated it, started building in 1927. He inaugurated it on my grandmother's birthday, again an auspicious date, which was April 4th, 1928. And that's when La Gloria number 3 that we're talking about was inaugurated. It had arches, It had sconces. It had all kinds of stucco decorations, and it has lights on the arches, so at night it looked really pretty. And the main thing was you could drive under the covered parking, so it was raining, you didn't have to get wet, and you didn't even have to get out of the car because the attendants would fill the tank with gas, they clean your windshield, all that. And I was very popular. So 18 months, a year and a half after La Gloria is inaugurated, on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. That ushered the Great Depression worldwide. And it was extensive. In other words, you couldn't get a job, you couldn't buy things because there was no manufacturing. It just everything came to a screeching halt, kind of like the pandemic, but worse, because it lasted a long time. And so my grandfather had a $30,000 loan from the Frost Bank still outstanding, probably most of it because he'd only opened La Gloria a year and a half before, and he needed to make money quickly so that he could make his payments. So he looked at the expansive roof that wasn't doing anything. He called in his engineer, and the engineer said, Mr. Elizondo, you could have anything you want on that roof. And he said, well, what about dances? He said, no problem. You actually need better structural integrity for a dance floor on a ceiling, on a roof, than you do for a parking lot, because the parking lot has the weight evenly distributed. You have cars that are sitting there for a long time, and then maybe one moves out, another moves in. But with a dance floor, you have no control over where the weight moves. If they all come to one side, to look over the rail, well, you have no control over that. But the structure was very solid, and that's what I tried to tell the city council in our story later on. He built the dance floor, he built an orchestra shell, and a concession stand. And then stairways going up and stairways coming down so that if there was a fire or something, they could escape quickly. Then he also put a railing around the roof area so that it would be safe. And he inaugurated La Gloria Roof Garden.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And so, that brings us to from the point that Matilde Elizondo, your uncle? Grandfather. I'm sorry. I'm following along. Grandfather started La Gloria, and then, eventually it becomes La Gloria Roof Garden. And thank you for clarifying, it was number 3. I think that's something that many people may not realize. So part of the reason I wanted La Gloria in these oral histories relative to West Side Sound was because of the music element. And so now we're kind of at that music element. One of the questions I want to ask you, and you may not have an exact answer for, because as you've mentioned to me in the past, that may not have been the music played there, but have you ever heard the term West Side Sound, and do you know what that means? What would that mean to you?
You are the first person who initiated me to this term. I think it's fascinating, and I'm not surprised, because San Antonio has been the incubator for so many different things, from civil rights movements and organizations to the first Spanish language television station, radio station, and the sanitary tortilla factory was the first mechanized tortilla factory in the nation, also in our neighborhood that got demolished. So I'm not surprised that we have our own version of the conjunto music.
And I think years later, after that music started coming out, is when the phrase was coined. Excuse me. So that does not surprise me, because many of the people that I've interviewed, it's kind of like, no, that was just music for us. It was not West Side Sound. So can you talk to us a little bit about what music came out of La Gloria and who was visiting La Gloria?
Definitely. I didn't even get to meet my grandfather. He died 5 years before I was born. But I have spoken to Cecilia Elizondo Herrera, my second cousin, whose father was... he was my father's first cousin, And unfortunately, Tio Juanito's father stayed in Mexico when the revolution. And so Mama Grandita, our great-grandmother, already was raising 8 children for her own and for grandchildren. And she couldn't take in these 3 boys, one of whom was Juan Elizondo. So he was sent, along with his brothers, to what is now St. Peter, St. Joseph Children's Home. And he learned English with Irish nuns and had a little bit of a brogue. So he was still a young boy when La Gloria was built. And my grandfather wanted to take him under his wing as soon as he could. So he hired Tio Juanito to be, so by now he's probably a preteen, young man. And he hired him to sell at the concession. They had sodas and popcorn and probably taquitos or, some snack that they could have during the dancing. And then he also would assign his sons and Tio Juanito to sweep after the dance was over. So he was working at La Gloria. And I asked Cecilia, what music do you think Tio Juanito heard? And she said that he always talked about the big bands. So big band was coming into its own and really having its heyday in the 30s. It lasted into the 40s, but big band, so we're talking Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, Benny Goodman, and they played songs like Stardust. I have a little list here of some of the songs that she told me that he would sing because he'd heard them at La Gloria. So we have Stardust, Begin the Begin, Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, music that was very popular at the time, and many other pieces. But they were the popular songs and bands because he wanted to attract everybody. Not only was he interested in making the loan payments, but he also wanted to have people come and enjoy themselves at La Gloria, and that probably would, as a brand, it helped La Gloria when you had people enjoying themselves dancing, and then they said, well, tomorrow I'm going to come back and buy some groceries or something like that. And so he welcomed the African Americans from the East Side. He welcomed the entire Hispanic community, the Mexican Americans. He welcomed the recent immigrants. There were still a lot of immigrants coming in. The Anglos. There were Germans. There were, everybody in the melting pot that San Antonio always has been was welcome at La Gloria, as opposed to the other establishments that didn't allow for segregation issues, or they wouldn't hire the all-black bands. And Papacito didn't have any problems. He was colorblind. He accepted everybody. He welcomed everybody. And so you have black bands playing jazz, and you have the big band sound. You have the romantic music, which some of the people who actually danced at La Gloria talk about. The boleros, the baladas, the trios, anything that would draw the public. And at that point, the Mexican music was really beautiful. It was very poetic. And, so Agustin Lara was probably starting at that point. Very poetic music.
I love his music.
It's just gorgeous. And so Mr. Flores, who owned the Alamo Music Company, says that he would dance cheek to cheek, with all this romantic music, because he was dating at that point. And the newlyweds would go there. The established couples, they would have their favorite music, and he would vary the bands every week. So you basically had Fridays and Saturday nights when he would have these events, and he would vary the bands so that he could attract the most people with different tastes in music. And there is a film that he commissioned, and this is kind of an interesting sidebar here. There were 2 producer-directors who were trying to make their way to Hollywood, the Depression. So they didn't have the cash to buy transportation. We didn't have airplanes in those days. I mean, it was a primitive time. And they were making their way across the country on their way to Hollywood, and they offered their services. So he contracted them, and they made a 16mm movie that includes my grandfather at his house and loading the car with all his kids and my grandmother Tita, and then they drive over to La Gloria, and you can see it in all its glory. And they also included dancing in, you know, as the event was going on and the band was playing, and you can see a Charleston contest. And so the girl is doing the Charleston, which is very popular in the 20s, and by now it's getting close to the 30s. But it was still popular, and he would award prizes to the best dancing couple. So that was another draw, that you could earn a little money when you went to La Gloria. And so the music was all, whatever the popular sounds of the day. And as we know, the accordion has a very pivotal place in this music that we're talking about, the West Side Sound. Now, we want to look at all the different venues that made the accordion get to San Antonio. One of them is the Germans, who settled in New Braunfels and all Green and all the different parts of Texas. But the accordion was invented in 1822 by a German musician, and I think he was an engineer actually. And so it becomes super popular in Italy, in France, in Poland, in Austria, in Germany. It just spread all over the place because of its quality to carry the melody and the bass. And it's portable. So you have sort of the same draw that the mariachi has. They're a portable band, right? But with the accordion, you could hire one accordionist if you didn't have a big budget for your quinceañera. And so it became very popular. Now, Maximilian, the Archduke Maximilian of Austria, was a member of the Habsburg family, and he was invited by Napoleon III, who really didn't have any say in Mexico at the time, but he was trying to put his foot in the territory, because the president was Benito Juarez. He was the democratically elected president of Mexico. And Mexico wanted to be a democracy, a representative democracy, republic like the United States. So Benito Juarez is the legitimate president of Mexico, and Maximilian comes in with the false pretense that people gave him. He didn't know that he wasn't wanted. He came because he was told that the Mexican people were clamoring and they wanted him to govern, and he actually did some very good things while he was in Mexico, which was only 3 years because he was assassinated. He arrived in 1864 and he was assassinated in 1867. He has a very ambitious wife named Carlota, Charlotte Amélie. She's a Belgian princess. And when they arrived, they remodeled the Castillo de Chapultepec, which was an ancient palace from the time of Moctezuma and Cuauhtémoc. But it was modeled, and it had several different buildings on it, and they made it a palace worthy of an emperor. So they brought French chefs, French bakers, and because of that, we have pan de dulce, campechana. Campechana in France is called millefeuille, which means 1,000 sheets. And it's actually a French pastry. And all these different varieties of French pastry and cooking. And they also brought entertainers because they wanted to have lavish parties on Chapultepec Hill. And so among these musicians were Germans, Poles, and Austrians who played the accordion. And the dances, in fact, it was almost like a roof garden. There's a terrace. If you ever visit the Castillo de Chapultepec, there's a terrace that overlooks the entire Mexico City. Beautiful. Technical difficulties.
Yes. Okay. So we had a a little lapse in the battery, and you were just mentioning Castillo de Chapultepec. Yes.
That was Maximilian's castle when they arrived in Mexico. I mean, it existed, but they revamped it. So it actually means the grasshopper hill, Chapultepec.
Oh, okay.
And he had, Carlota had these beautiful dances and galas and lots of food and lots of music. And so he recruited musicians from Germany, Austria, and other countries, Poland, who were very well versed with the accordion. And they brought all this music over, but he also elevated the traje de charro, de gala, the one that the charros wear when they do their suertes and all that, the real elegant one, he elevated that to the status of a tuxedo. So you could appear at any court or any fancy place in Europe or Mexico or wherever with your traje de charro de gala, and you were admitted as, you know, wearing formal wear. So that was Maximilian. And so the mariachi also comes out of this because the Frenchmen who were living in Mexico, being bakers and chefs, when they had their quinceañeras and when they had their weddings, they wanted a band that could come right away to their house and then maybe go to the neighbor's house and whatever. And mariachi comes from mariage, which means wedding in French. So that aspect of the music developed because they were portable and they could do 5 or 6 gigs in one night, you know, going from venue to venue. So going back to the accordion, I have done a little research myself, and I haven't found where it exactly says this, but I think you can extrapolate that if Maximilian brings these musicians with their accordions to Mexico, and from the beginning, there was a movement to oust him because they had a president, and this small faction that had economic interests and power interests in keeping Maximilian in place, including the Europeans, that for all political purposes, they, you know, so the Mexican people started a movement following Benito Juarez and supporting him, and eventually he is unfortunately assassinated in Querétaro at the Cerro de las Campanas in the summer of 1867. What I'm thinking is that these musicians probably didn't want to stay around Mexico City because of the backlash, you know, of the rejection. And it wasn't a rejection of them or their culture. It was simply that they were tired of being imposed, you know, Santana and all these people. So they now had a very intelligent president that they wanted to keep, Benito Juarez. And I think these Germans and Poles migrated towards Nuevo León because now you have all these immigrants coming in. In some cases, they were actually recruited to build the railroads, and you know, Porfirio Diaz, he brought in a lot of foreigners. So a lot of these Germans and Poles and Austrians migrated towards the Nuevo León area, and that's where you have norteño music, because they brought their accordions. And then we have the German immigrants coming into Texas, but there's also another source, and that is the French. The French in the Louisiana area, it's documented that they educated the African Americans in the New Orleans area and in Louisiana with classical music study so that they could play the accordions that were very popular in France at their parties. So we have this influx of accordions coming in from all sides. I mean, they came into the East Coast too, but locally we have all these accordionists and people who were well versed in both the button and the piano style accordions And during the Depression, everybody's moving towards the cities to be able to get a job. So all these influences come into San Antonio. And again, La Gloria, the goal of Papacito, of Matilde Elizondo, was to bring as many people as possible, have nice, clean fun, and be able to satisfy the musical tastes of as many people as possible. Mm-hmm. So that's how come La Gloria becomes kind of an incubator for the emerging West Side sound, even though perhaps it wasn't strictly played there because it was just developing. Really, the music was just being born in the casitas and in the quinceañeras, and and everybody was experimenting with all these different forms because they're seeing African Americans playing kind of a French beat, and then they've got the Germans, and they've got the Poles, and then the people from the Slavic people who came in from Nuevo Leon, so it's kind of like melting everything and recooking it, and now you have your own West Side sound. Absolutely.
And just briefly, I don't think I asked this question. Do you remember the address of La Gloria, or what intersection it was? I don't think I gave like a directional.
Yes, it was Brazos en Laredo, and I think I have a picture where we can get the address.
Oh yes,
it was 7. I want to say 70 something.
But the corner of Brazos and Laredo.
Yes.
If you don't mind me asking, and we'll kind of get into the preservation in a little bit. What is there now?
A metal truck repair shop.
Oh, Eliseos, I think.
Well,
okay.
It was Limon.
Oh, okay.
Tony
Limon, yes.
Was the one who demolished it.
Wow, okay. And we'll get into that story a little bit here. So that's, thank you for kind of making that tie-in of the music. And that's definitely what we're hitting on with our interviews, is seeing that maybe locations like La Gloria, like Lermas, and like others, did not intentionally say, let's go make West Side sound. But because they had all this musical influence around, that may have been what led to the discovery of these different sounds by younger people back then, that grew and grew and grew. So thank you for making that connection for us. I want to kind of segue a little bit into, you've mentioned it many times, but just in a however you want to explain it, what types of people do you think came to La Gloria? What types of people have you heard of, or that you have known to have visited La Gloria?
My goodness, I have had the privilege to meet, in this case, 2 gentlemen who remember La Gloria distinctly, remember Matilde Elizondo. One of them was 93 years old. His name was Mr. Rojas, and he was so passionate about La Gloria because he met his wife dancing at La Gloria, that when we had a hearing to try and save the building, he was there the entire time, and it was 6 hours.
Wow.
It was a 6-hour hearing. And he was there, and I'll never forget it. I was sitting right next to him, and when the judge, there was no jury. It was just the judge deciding what he wanted to do, David Peoples. And when he decided and announced it, he turned to me and he said, "Ganamos? Did we win?" And I had to tell him no. I couldn't even speak. I just nodded no. And he was devastated. I was just so heartbroken.
Well,
But there's another gentleman I wanted to tell you about, if I may.
Yes,
His name is Jesse Vidales. He's still with us.
Oh, he's a local leader.
Yes, he's 100 years old. And he remembers walking by La Gloria on his way to Lanier High School as a young man. And he said my grandfather always gave him some refreshment or something so that he could eat or drink on a hot summer day on his way to Lanier, and he never forgot it. Mr. Rojas told me another thing that I really treasure. He said that he never saw Matilde Elizondo improperly dressed or, kind of cash, the way we dress nowadays. He always wore dress pants and a suit, and if he was working and it was a hot day, he would wear a white shirt and a tie. But he never saw him without a shirt, a white shirt and a tie.
Wow.
He was always dressed for business and for dealing with people, and he had a very embracing kind of attitude to everyone, and welcoming and making them feel that they were, a part of his entourage, his life. And that's something I really admire, because we are kind of lacking in that a little bit nowadays. If I could just interject another little thing, that my Uncle Deli, he was one of my grandfather's sons, he said that there was a band called Red Nichols and his Five Pinks, and the part of the story that warms my heart is, I'm not sure if it was this band, but he said that there was an all-black band who played at La Gloria, and when he was recruited for World War II, he joined the Navy. So one day he's in New York having a day of leave, sort of like Gene Kelly in the movies, and he's walking down a Manhattan nightclub, and he sees the name of this band that he met at La Gloria. So he stopped in, heard the music, and afterwards he went backstage and he said, "Hey guys," and they said, "Deli, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, why are you in Manhattan?" They said, "We made it big. We started at La Gloria, and look where we've gotten. Now we're in Manhattan. We have our own gig." So that, I'm sure there are countless stories like that.
Absolutely. Well, you just kind of mentioned it, and I want to just note that the reason why we're doing these interviews is because of preservation work. And so often we think of preservation solely in the sense of structures, but also preservation work now looks like saving those stories and those oral histories and those video interviews. And so similar to what we're doing here, you all were doing in reference to La Gloria #3 back then. And I want to kind of get your overview of what that case looked like, and what, if you feel comfortable talking about it, what led to the demolition of La Gloria, and why that's so important to San Antonio and the music that represents San Antonio. And while I understand there are so many other things that make La Gloria important, just because of the context of this project, we're talking. I want to make sure we shine a light on that music aspect too, on what it provided the community.
Well, and you're absolutely right, Geremy. If it had been the first multi-pump station in San Antonio, if it had been, your first store where you could get supplies like a convenience store, or if it had been where you could wire money to Mexico, it wouldn't have stayed in people's hearts. The reason that La Gloria was so important, and what warmed my heart when I mean, initially, I'm out trying to save my grandfather's building because it had his name on it, and because I had personal connections to it. But I see all these people passionately trying to save the building. It was the music. It was being able to dance under the stars with your sweetheart, and keeping those memories of your first date, your first kiss, your first baby, when you did, because again, families were welcome at La Gloria, and you could take your whole family. You didn't have to leave them behind with a babysitter, which in those days you couldn't afford a babysitter. So the whole family came. Gentlemen, 25 cents, ladies and children, free. So it was a great place, a wholesome place to take your family. I had my experience with La Gloria, because I wasn't in San Antonio for so many years, when the city decided to demolish our home and our business, we would come to visit, or the little pieces of time that we were in San Antonio, and my father would drive me by Brazos de Laredo, and he would say, "Look, Pati, it says there in mosaic, Matilde Elizondo, proprietor. That's your grandfather." And he would start crying. It just drove him to tears, because he lost his father when he was only 30 years old. My grandfather was 52 years old And it was a very unexpected death. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, never smoked a cigarette in his entire life, never let his children smoke, ever. And by early 1949, by November 14th, 1949, he died.
So very short before you were born.
Well, I was born in 55.
Yeah,
so it was 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact, I mean, I hate to say it, but these building codes have a double-edged sword. I have been thinking about this for a long time, and I think the fact that the building codes included or forced you, or whatever you want to say, to include to build asbestos into your building, it was a flame retardant, that causes lung cancer. And when I looked at the dates of when La Gloria was inaugurated, and I think, well, being so hands-on, probably Papacito would go to the work site, you know, and to see how everything was going, and when they were applying the asbestos, probably went into his lungs, and then 20 years later, he died of lung cancer. So La Gloria almost, you could say, cost him his life, and I'm sure a lot of other people too, but we didn't know that, you know, and the authorities banned it years later, decades later. So I think that was an issue. But here's what happened. I'm at my office with my freelance job, handling the phones and doing work, and I get a phone call from the Express News. This reporter says, Miss Elizondo, I would like your comment on the issue of La Gloria coming up tomorrow at City Council. They're going to demolish the building. What do you think?
Do you remember who the reporter was?
I don't think I put it in this, but I could probably.
It'd be interesting to find the. I asked so I can maybe find the article, or unless you have.
I have the article.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have the article, and I can tell you when, because November 8th. So he calls me on November 7th, and he says this is going to happen, blah blah. So on November 9th is when 2001. Excuse me. That's when it happened. We just had 9/11. So I'm stunned. I said, what do you mean they're going to demolish that? I mean, you know, I had visions of my father crying in front of the building, and I said, what? And he said, yes, it's up for demolition, and I'd like your comment. So I called everybody I knew who had an interest in historic preservation. I called Phyllis McKenzie from the Institute of Texan Cultures, who came not representing the ITC, but as a citizen, and she testified before the council, please save this building. I called Cecilia, my cousin, Cecilia Elizondo, and she came, and my uncle Juanito Elizondo had Parkinson's disease by that time, and he took all night to write 2 pages and explain what La Gloria meant to him, and she read it before the council. I testified, my mom went with me. I had just, I reached out to everybody I could. And then I'm surprised because the Conservation Society vice president was there, Loretta Huddleston, and she said, this building needs to be saved. We've been having our eye on this building for a long time, and it's historic. Anne McGlone, the Historic Preservation Officer of the city of San Antonio, said, you know, this building, even though Limon had taken out, I think it was Limon, took out the arches, so he defaced the building, but she said the building is still sound, and what it means to the community is still viable, it's still vibrant. And she showed the 60mm film that my grandfather had commissioned in front of the city council. And then Sananto showed up, Manny Castillo, and he said, I really would love to have our headquarters inside La Gloria. We have a building next to Patty Radels and her husband's. They have a food pantry, you know. And he said, we don't have enough space, and we have 8-year-olds that are learning journalism. And I thought, oh my goodness. I mean, a lot of people want this building, and here's a use for it, you know. If I saved it, I mean, what could I do with it? I wouldn't. First of all, it didn't belong to us anymore, but secondly, what do you do with it? And here's Manny Castillo. So we all got together afterwards, and I want to say one thing, because I've never seen this at City Council, before or since. When the vote was cast, we had 3 Save La Gloria votes and 8 Demolish La Gloria votes. And the councilman of District 5, David Garcia, not the priest, but a lawyer who was the councilman, had not been elected. There hadn't been an elected official for District 5 for 10 years. The councilmen, when they were about to term out, they would resign, and then the city council would appoint someone, and that's how he got into city council. Okay, so he walks off the dais during a city council meeting, mind you, when they just voted to demolish La Gloria, and he shook hands with Mr. Limon, the owner of La Gloria. I said, what in the world? It sounded very fishy to me. So I just wanted to interject that, because I don't think that's normal. And if you watch city council meetings, that doesn't happen.
Do you remember who else? I'm sorry. Do you remember who else was on council at that time?
Yes. All right. So we had Bonnie Connor, who was my district council member, and Julian Castro, who was District 7. So she was District 8, Julian District 7, and Ed Garza was the mayor. They voted to save La Gloria. And on the other side, we had, in fact, 2 of them were ousted for moral turpitude. David Garcia was ousted for moral turpitude charges. He was kicked out. And they also, the FBI also investigated. I mean, this is all public record. I'm not telling you secrets. I can't get in trouble because this is all on the public record. Here we are. All right, so the sponsor of the zoning change, which destroyed La Gloria, David A. Garcia, District 5 councilman, was ousted for moral turpitude. John Sanders, District 3 councilman, and Enrique Quique Martin, District 4 councilman, were later indicted by the FBI and convicted of bribery and other abuses of power. So out of this 11-member board, 3 of them kicked out. And so then what I did was I spearheaded cooperation among several community groups. We called it Save La Gloria Alliance. I used all my skill as a former reporter and all my skill as in the advertising media world, because it's very important what you call things. And if your name is too long and complicated, people lose interest. But Save La Gloria was the heart of the matter. We wanted to save this building called La Gloria. And eventually, a lot of people came forward. One member of the community offered the owner $70,000 to buy it. Another person offered him most of, I think, 5 acres in a land swap where he had this property near a state highway, so that the trucks were passing all the time, so it would have been very good for him to have this property. I spoke to Commissioner Patricia Elizondo, who's not related, but he and my father were friends because my father was theater manager at the Alameda, and Mr. Elizondo had a band that would play all the time there. And so he called the council, the county office that deals with properties, and he said, I'm going to send you Patty Elizondo, no relation, and I want you to show her all the different properties. I want like a certain 5-mile radius around La Gloria to see what the county owns. And then with the planning director, Mr. Emilio Monsiváis at City Hall, they got together and they looked at what city and county properties could be swapped. But Limon wouldn't have it. He just didn't want it. And then, to top it all off, Esperanza was very busy because they were fighting their own lawsuit with the city. And they won right before we were going to the court to argue the case. And so Esperanza Peace and Justice Center offered Limon $243,000. A check they just received, but his heart remained unmoved.
Wow.
Because he told one of my supporters, he said, I'm going to demolish it because I can. Now, I don't have any ill feelings because everybody has a free will, and he was the owner. When my father died, my Aunt Dora sold it because, you know, the family was already up in age, and so, you know, the property was being leased, and then the person who was making payments died also, so his family and my Aunt Dora wrote out the deed and sold the property, and then Mr. Limon bought it. But there is a God, and God knows what goes on in people's hearts. And so, in my mind, Geremy, I think it would have been cheaper for him to take a piece of land that was being offered to him, because to demolish La Gloria took 2 whole days because of the rebar and the concrete and the brick. It was very sturdy. And when David Garcia, the councilman, said, it's dilapidated, it's going to fall on somebody's head, it's a nuisance, it's an eyesore. I mean, those words really, really hurt, because it wasn't any of these things. When they, when they took away the arches, it didn't alter the building. They could have been constructed back in. And the fact that it was so sturdy, I consulted, and I have the name. I have a gentleman who was a Texas registered professional engineer, Mr. John L. Wilson of Wilson and Associates, who I asked to view the building, and he inspected it, and he wrote in a letter, I have visited and inspected the structure and have found that it is essentially sound. The structure shows no sagging, leaning, or recent spalling that would indicate imminent collapse. The structure is reinforced concrete. And he told me that it's the same construction of the state highways. Again, Zachary built it. Mm-hmm. Zachary is the builder of the state highways. So really, it didn't have to come down. Mm-hmm. And if we had had better representation at City Council, the person in the zoning commission that made this happen, because there were 15 people that made up, architects that made up Historic Design and Review Commission, they all voted to save La Gloria. 15 architects. We had Anne McGlone, the Historic Preservation Officer, I just mentioned. We had all of these groups, including the Conservation Society. But if we had had better representation at City Council, this wouldn't have happened. And I guess the point of all this is, if you don't vote, and if you don't assess who is running, and vet it out and ask questions, call them up, ask them questions, go to their rallies, figure out who these people are, and then vote, you're going to have these things happening over and over and over. Mm-hmm. Because the powers that be can get their candidates to do whatever they want, because they pay for the candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Their coffers, and not all candidates are like that. They're very honest people, like yourself, but there are a lot of people who really just want the goodies. If you become a council member, you have free parking at the airport for life, and you have other goodies that we don't even know about.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it just goes on and on. So a lot of people run and spend 2 years acting like a city councilman, and then they have all these freebies. So it's very important, because La Gloria did not have to die, and she didn't die. They elevated her to the status of a legend. Now she will never fade.
I love that you mentioned La Gloria and personified La Gloria as a woman. Why is that?
Because La Gloria really means heaven. And it comes from the Latin for triumph, for victory, and for heaven, literally. And that's why Papacito, my grandfather Matilde, named it, because he was honoring God and the blessings he had received by leaving that war and the death and destruction, and being able to come to San Antonio and raise a family along with his own family. But La Gloria also means hope, because why do we have, in a spiritual sense, we look forward to our life in heaven.
Okay, so we ended on La Gloria also means hope, and we just had a small technical difficulty. But if you want to continue on La Gloria and what it means to you, that would be great.
Well, La Gloria means heaven, but also the word has connotations of triumph, of something that you cherish, because you think of heaven as a place that you want to go to. And I think La Gloria had this aura of acceptance, sort of like a mother embraces all her children, no matter what their color, or if they're good in school or not, or if they misbehave. She embraces all her children. And I think that's the idea that people got when they went to La Gloria, that they were welcome, that they could have a good time, that it was safe. Patricia Elizondo had plainclothes police, women and men, to make sure that, my Uncle Deli says that sometimes they would lower a rope, and bring up alcohol. It's just during Prohibition, but it was done all the time at the speakeasies, and he wouldn't allow it. They would catch this person and they would remove the alcohol. And then also lewd dancing, so if they got too close, the tango was big, and they didn't play tangos in La Gloria, because again, it was an example to the little ones. He wanted to be able to make a home welcome for them. And I think that the fact that it was so family oriented in people's minds translated to a mother. So La Gloria is female, but it also was the embrace of La Gloria. Now, let me tell you another interesting little tidbit here that has to do with Brazos, which is one of the streets that runs at the corner of Brazos and Laredo, is where La Gloria was. Brazos originally was, the entire name came because Fray Antonio Virgil de Jesus, who built San Jose Mission, was one of the greatest Franciscan priests that we had during the conquest of Mexico and subsequent. He came as a 24-year-old, and he was very cognizant of the value of the culture of the people that he was talking to about Christianity about. And he also built schools and churches, and we're very lucky that he built San Jose because he decided he wanted to die here. This was going to be his last assignment, and then he was called to Mexico. So one day, he's crossing a river in North Texas, and the current grabs him. And the people were thinking that this was the end of Fray Antonio Virgil de Jesus, their hero. And so somehow he ends up downriver, and they find him, and they said, "Los brazos de Dios te salvaron, Fray Antonio Virgil de Jesus. The arms of our Lord saved you." And that's where the Rio Brazos names comes from. It's Los Brazos de Dios. So one of the supporters of La Gloria wrote a beautiful poem that I think it was Pablo Martinez. You might look him up. That said, La Gloria, tus brazos, that idea that we're talking about, where the building embraced people and held them up to her bosom so that they could have a nice respite from the depression and all the misery that was going on. People not having enough food and not having electricity and all the different things that were going on. And La Gloria was a little interruption in that. And again, for 25 cents per gentleman and ladies and children free, nice, clean fun. And that was the beginning of the West Side Sound.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I think we've covered a lot of ground we're right at the end of our time together. What else would you like to share that we didn't get a chance to talk about? Is there any final thoughts, or as sometimes Graciela will mention, any consejos to take with us as well through this?
Well, I think the fact that we are a culture, the West Side culture, is really the heart of San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
It's made up of family, it's made up of honesty and integrity and honor and love. I have seen and I have been, in funerals. And I can remember when I was burying my mother at San Fernando Cemetery, when the West Siders see a procession with a hearse and all the cars following, they stop. They're walking around the street, they stop and they either tip their hat or they put their hand, or somehow they show respect to this deceased member of the community. And I haven't seen that anywhere else. And that, I think, speaks loads. It speaks volumes for the people that make up the West Side, and that we are we're a community that sticks together and helps each other. One of the things that really hurt me when I was investigating the neighborhood that I lived in as a baby, and I was doing a piece for the Archdiocese of San Antonio on the church, on the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Corazón de María. And I went to the city archives, and Geremy, it was filled with words like derelict and prostitution and urban blight and all these horrible words. This was my neighborhood. And I said, this doesn't make sense. So I went home and I asked my 94-year-old mother, I don't remember how old she was at the time, but she was in her 90s. I said, Mommy, do you remember anything like this going on? She said, no. It was a beautiful, thriving community. You didn't have to use a car because there was a sanitary tortilla factory for your tortillas, there was a cleaners, there was a doctor, there was actually an orphanage there. There was the school for the grade school kids that Immaculate Heart of Mary sponsored. There was anything you needed, barbershops, anything you needed. And she only used the car when she went to Joske's, way over on the other side of town. She said it was a community where everybody helped each other. And if somebody had a need, everyone would pitch in. When I was born, this is kind of a silly story, but it just tells you, my mom, I was a cesarean birth, cesarean section kid, and so my mom had to stay in the hospital for 2 weeks after I was born. And my grandmother came from Monterrey to take care of me. And my mother says that when she washed the first diaper, we didn't have Pampers in those days. They washed the diapers, and she put it on the, the line there. The entire neighborhood came to congratulate the family because they had lost a baby before me, and they knew about this. So they all came to congratulate my parents, and then my mother says that the family gave us 33 dresses and she didn't have to buy anything for 2 years for me to wear. So it just shows you the kind of community we are, and I'm always very proud as a reporter and as a citizen to see that when people's loved one is killed, usually tragically in some unexpected way, everybody pitches in for the family. I don't know of any other city that is like that. And so I'm very proud that La Gloria is exemplary of this beautiful, all-encompassing, loving community that grew around La Gloria and around the West Side, and that is San Antonio.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for taking time to sit with me for this project. This project, like I mentioned in the beginning, will be used for our West Side Sound Oral History project, which is being funded through the West Side Community Partnerships grant. So we received a grant to conduct these interviews. I personally am using these interviews as well for the completion of my capstone project for my master's in public history at St. Mary's University. So I'm very excited to have you be a part of this interview. This will be my 6th interview completed, and then I will, for now, be done with these interviews. But in the future, if there are things you want to add or amend to this interview, please reach out to myself or to the rest of the team, and we can accomplish that for you. And you will be able to access this interview on YouTube once it's up, and through the UTSA Special Collections at the University of Texas San Antonio. And we thank you very much for taking part in this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.